On October 23, 1956, 200,000 people marched through the streets of Budapest. They were students, factory workers, soldiers, grandmothers. They had one demand: get the Soviets out of Hungary. By nightfall, they had toppled a giant bronze statue of Joseph Stalin and dragged it through the streets. All that remained on the pedestal were Stalin's boots. Someone planted a Hungarian flag inside them. For 5 days, it looked like they had won. The Soviet army withdrew. Hungary was free. And then Moscow changed its mind. The question that haunts this story is not why Hungary rose. It is why the country that rose alone was left to fall alone. To understand what happened in Budapest, you need to understand what Hungary had been living through for the previous decade. Since 1947, Hungary had been ruled by Matyas Rákosi, a man nicknamed Little Stalin. Rákosi modeled his government on everything Stalin had built: secret police, show trials, forced collectivization, and labor camps. The Hungarian secret police, the AVH, were so feared and so hated that ordinary people crossed the street to avoid walking past their headquarters. By the time Stalin died in 1953, Hungary had one of the most repressive governments in the entire Soviet bloc. The economy had been hollowed out, the standard of living had collapsed, and the population was exhausted, angry, and afraid. The pressure had nowhere to go. Then someone unbolted the lid. That someone was Nikita Khrushchev. In February 1956, Khrushchev gave a secret speech to the Soviet Communist Party denouncing Stalin's brutality, his purges, and his cult of personality. The speech was meant to be internal, but it leaked almost immediately. Across Eastern Europe, people who had spent a decade being told that Stalin was infallible suddenly learned that even the Soviets now admitted he had been a monster. In Hungary, the effect was electric. If Stalin had been wrong, then Rákosi had been wrong. If Rákosi had been wrong, then the entire system was wrong. Intellectuals began to speak openly, students organized, and the pressure built through the summer and autumn of 1956. Then, on October 23rd, it exploded. The march began peacefully. Students from the Budapest University of Technology drew up a list of 16 demands, including free elections, the withdrawal of Soviet troops, and the dismantling of the Stalin statue. Thousands joined them as they walked through the city. By late afternoon, the crowd had swelled to 200,000. They gathered outside the Parliament building and outside the national radio station, demanding that their 16 points be broadcast. The AVH guards inside the radio building responded by opening fire on the unarmed crowd. That was the moment the protest became a revolution. Hungarian soldiers sent to restore order tore the red stars from their caps and joined the crowd. Military depots were broken open and weapons distributed. Police cars were overturned and set alight, and the crowd surged toward the enormous bronze Stalin, standing on its tribune at the edge of the city park. It took them hours to bring it down. They cut it at the knees with welding torches and pulled it with steel cables until it fell. They dragged the broken statue through the streets. All that was left standing were his boots. Within hours, the fighting had spread across the city, and the Soviets, watching from their barracks, were not yet sure what they were looking at. The most famous pocket of resistance was the Corvin Cinema, a theater in the 8th District surrounded by narrow alleyways that Soviet tanks could not navigate. Young men and women with no military training armed themselves with rifles and Molotov cocktails and turned the Corvin into a fortress. They would emerge from the alleyways, hurl petrol bombs at Soviet tanks, and disappear before the turrets could turn. One of their leaders was a factory worker named János Mess, known as Wooden Leg Johnny, who had lost his left leg in an accident years earlier. He hobbled through the streets of Budapest with a rifle over his shoulder, a bandage around his jaw from a wound he had received in the fighting, and a fedora hat on his head. More than a dozen Soviet tanks were destroyed at the Corvin alone. Across Budapest, the pattern was the same. Poorly equipped but highly mobile fighters armed with rifles and petrol bombs proved devastatingly effective against Soviet armor in the narrow streets. The Soviets had expected a police operation. What they got was a city fighting for its life. The rest of Hungary followed. Across the countryside, revolutionary workers' councils took over local government. Communist Red Stars were torn down from public buildings. Soviet war memorials were dismantled. VH officers were rounded up. In some places, they were beaten or killed on sight. The accumulated hatred of a decade of surveillance and persecution released in hours. The Hungarian army largely sided with the revolution, opening depots and handing weapons to anyone who asked. And then, at the Kilian barracks in Budapest, the revolution found its general. A Hungarian colonel named Pál Malater had been ordered by the government to secure the building and prevent it from falling to the insurgents. Instead, he turned his tanks on the Soviets and destroyed an advancing column. Malater became the revolution's most prominent military leader overnight, promoted from colonel to general within days. Hungary, a country of 10 million people that had been one of the most tightly controlled states in the Soviet bloc, had risen as one. Then something astonishing happened. The Soviets withdrew. On October 28th, after 5 days of fighting, Moscow ordered its troops out of Budapest. A ceasefire was declared. Soviet tanks rumbled out of the city and back toward the Hungarian border. Imre Nagy, a reformist communist who had been swept into the premiership by the revolution, began forming a new government. He announced free elections. He dissolved the secret police. Political prisoners were released. Cardinal Mindszenty, who had been imprisoned for years, was freed and welcomed back to Budapest by cheering crowds. For the first time in nearly a decade, Hungarians could say what they thought, read what they wanted, and walk the streets without fear of the AVH. On November 1st, Nagy made the decision that sealed Hungary's fate. He declared that Hungary was leaving the Warsaw Pact. For the first time since 1945, a country behind the Iron Curtain was attempting to break free. For 4 extraordinary days, Hungary was a free country. Some people dared to believe it would last. The question was whether the West would let it. It would not. And the most painful part of that answer is that the Hungarians genuinely believed otherwise. Radio Free Europe, the American-funded broadcaster that had been beaming anti-communist programming into Eastern Europe for years, had spent years telling listeners that the captive nations of the Soviet bloc would one day be free. When the revolution broke out, Radio Free Europe's Hungarian service covered it with overwhelming sympathy, broadcasting reports of strikes and resistance, denouncing Soviet brutality, and on one notorious occasion, broadcasting tactical advice on how to make a Molotov cocktail to use against Soviet tanks. There is no evidence that Radio Free Europe ever explicitly promised Western military intervention. Later archival reviews would confirm that no broadcast ever made that promise outright. But to a Hungarian listening in Budapest, with American voices pouring praise on the revolution and detailing how to fight Soviet armor, the implication felt obvious. They believed help was coming. It was not. And later investigations would conclude that the tone of those broadcasts, even without an explicit promise, helped sustain a hope that was never going to be fulfilled because the United States was never going to come. President Eisenhower was consumed by a separate crisis on the other side of the Mediterranean. Britain, France, and Israel had just invaded Egypt to seize the Suez Canal, and they had done it without American approval. Eisenhower was furious at his own allies and was facing a major international confrontation of his making. He was not about to provoke the Soviet Union over Hungary at the same time. The American position was that they could not credibly condemn Soviet intervention in Hungary, while approving British and French intervention in Egypt. The CIA, despite years of anti-communist rhetoric and covert operations, had no agents on the ground in Budapest. Its main sources of information were refugee interviews and Western newspapers. Hungary was, in operational terms, entirely alone, and the broadcasts that had given them hope had given them nothing else. On November the 3rd, a Hungarian military delegation led by General Pál Malater, the same officer who had turned his tanks on the Soviets at Kilian, sat down with Soviet commanders to negotiate the final withdrawal of Soviet troops. A timetable was agreed. The deadline was January 15, 1957. The agreement was to be signed that evening. It was never signed. While Melitor negotiated in good faith, KGB officers led by General Ivan Serov burst into the room and arrested the entire Hungarian delegation. It had been a trap from the beginning. The Soviets had never intended to leave. At 5 o'clock the next morning, Soviet tanks rolled back into Budapest. The operation was called Whirlwind. 17 divisions crossed the border from every direction. This was not the cautious intervention of late October. This was a full-scale invasion. Soviet units seized Hungarian air bases, communication centers, and key bridges before the defenders could organize. The Hungarian army, leaderless and disarmed division by division, surrendered most of its equipment without firing a shot. Soviet tanks crept along the main roads and fired indiscriminately into buildings. They could not tell fighters from civilians and in many cases did not try. The strongest resistance came from the working-class district of Sepel on the Danube and from the same Corvin Cinema that had held out during the first battle, now under the command of a young fighter named Gergely Pongratz. The Corvin held on for 6 more days against artillery and tank fire. The Kilian barracks fell the same way. Outside the capital, the steel town of Dunajvaros held out until November the 11th. Those insurgents still alive formed mobile guerrilla groups and launched desperate hit-and-run attacks on Soviet patrols. None of it could change what was happening. At 5:20 in the morning on November the 4th, Imre Nagy walked into a radio studio and recorded a final message to his country. The broadcast lasted 35 seconds. He said, "This is Imre Nagy speaking. Today at daybreak, Soviet forces started an attack against our capital with the obvious intention of overthrowing the legal Hungarian democratic government. Our troops are fighting. The government is in its place." That was it. 35 seconds. Then silence. It was the last the Hungarian people heard from their prime minister. Nagy took refuge in the Yugoslav embassy. 18 days later, holding a written guarantee of safe passage from the new Kadar government, he stepped out of the embassy. He was seized on the spot. He was taken to Romania, held in secret for 2 years, then brought back to Budapest, tried in secret, and hanged on June 16, 1958. General Melitor was executed alongside him. Their bodies were buried face down in unmarked graves, a final insult. When the fighting ended, approximately 2,500 Hungarians were dead and 20,000 wounded. Roughly 700 Soviet soldiers had been killed. In the weeks that followed, the new Soviet-installed government under Janos Kadar carried out mass arrests. An estimated 33,000 people were detained, 230 were executed, and then came the exodus. 200,000 Hungarians fled the country, crossing the Austrian border on foot in the middle of winter. Families walked through snow-covered fields at night, carrying children, leaving behind everything they owned. The Austrian border guards, overwhelmed, let them through. Refugee camps were set up across Austria, and the stream of Hungarians continued for weeks. It was one of the largest refugee crises in post-war European history. 200,000 people, more than 2% of Hungary's entire population, chose exile over living under Soviet rule. Among those who left were athletes, scientists, writers, doctors, and an entire generation of young Hungarians who would build new lives in America, Canada, Australia, Britain, and across Western Europe. Most of them never went back. Time magazine named the Hungarian freedom fighter its Man of the Year for 1956. The world admired their courage. The world did nothing to save them. Public discussion of the revolution was suppressed in Hungary for more than 30 years. The government called it a counter-revolution, a fascist uprising, a conspiracy by Western agents. The people who fought in it were branded criminals. The people who fled were traitors. In schools, children were taught that the Soviet intervention had saved Hungary from capitalist restoration. The truth was buried so thoroughly that an entire generation of Hungarians grew up not knowing what had actually happened in their own capital in 1956. The names of the dead were not spoken. The graves of the executed were unmarked. The boots of the Stalin statue were quietly removed, and the square renamed. It was not until 1989, when the communist system finally collapsed across Eastern Europe, that Hungary acknowledged what had actually happened. On June 16, 1989, exactly 31 years to the day since their execution, Imre Nagy and Palma later were exhumed from their unmarked graves, rehabilitated, and reburied with full state honors in Hero Square. 250,000 people attended the ceremony. It was one of the defining moments of the end of communism in Europe. On October 23, 1989, exactly 33 years after the revolution began, Hungary declared itself a republic. October 23rd became a national holiday. At the place where the Stalin statue once stood, a monument now commemorates the revolution. The boots are gone. The flag remains. If your family has a connection to 1956, or if this is a story you think more people should know, tell me in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this.